I'd like to introduce the first panel of incredibly impressive people. So first, I'll just start with what is this panel about? So we call it Trust, Truth, and the Future of Journalism. In a conversation centered on the future of journalism, panelists will discuss the issue of trust, how organizations are adapting to new consumption habits, and how educators can help prepare their students for today's media environment. And these wonderful people are coming up to our stage. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it off to Kyle Pope, who is the moderator of this panel, and he is the editor-in-chief of Columbia Journalism Review, and we're really happy to have him be a part of this event. So Kyle, it's all you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having us. As Steve said, all of us spend some part of our lives talking to panels of media people, and it's so refreshing not to be doing that today. In fact, I thought it'd be cool if we just sort of rotated this whole thing around so we could hear you. We're going to do that. We'll have plenty of time for questions after we chat, but we're all really excited to be here. I don't want to give a big wind-up, so I'm just going to start with Steve. As Michelle said, Steve Adler is the editor-in-chief of Reuters. You talked, Steve, in your opening remarks about this issue of trust and this crisis that we have because of a lack of trust in media. Could you break down sort of, one, why you think that's happened, but then sort of what are the elements of it that we could look at to sort of try to rebuild this?
Sure, and thank you, Kyle. I mean, to me, the first thing when people ask me about trust and what can we do to make the media more trusted, I say be trustworthy. So it's sort of obvious, tend your own garden, but I think it's really important for every news organization to think hard about what they're doing and whether, in fact, they are doing things that will encourage people to trust them. I think the breakdown in trust, and I talked about it a little bit before, has something to do with how many organizations there are and also how polarized our society is. So it's easy to attack, it's easy to claim, particularly on social media, that news organizations are making up their sources, that they don't really care what the facts are. Everybody can accuse each other of participating in fake news. So I think it's really important that we reestablish our understanding of ourselves as a profession with professional standards, and that we not only behave in a professional way, but then we share with people more than we have traditionally done how we're working. So we created at Reuters something called Backstory, which tells you something about how we went about reporting particular stories. We have something in the charter of the company called the Reuters Trust Principles, which require us to behave with integrity and independence and freedom from bias, and we now put that at the bottom of every story on the website. But I think more important than any of that, again, is to behave in a trustworthy way, and it's sort of going back to for the student journalist to sort of first principles. What goes into making a story trustworthy? The first thing to me is starting with an open mind. You may have a premise or a notion of where the facts are going, but you start with an open mind and let the facts get in the way of a good story. You know the old expression, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. You should let the facts get in the way of a good story. Allow the story to go where it goes. You have to give fair comment to the people in the story. I think one of the reasons people don't trust journalists, and as like occasional, unfortunately, subject of journalism, it's amazing how many people don't ask us for comment. They just write something about Reuters that is very often not true, and they don't ask for comment. So asking for comment, waiting for the comment, getting fair comment, and caring what people say, and actually maybe changing your story based on the comment is one of the elements of trust. The next thing that I think is incredibly important when you're done with a story, and I always tell this to the team, is ask yourself what's the worst thing somebody's going to be able to say about your story when it gets published. And don't try to figure out how they're going to say nice things. Make sure you have an answer that you're very comfortable with. What's your answer that you're comfortable with? If they're going to attack the story, do you feel as if you have a good answer you feel good about, and that's ethically, morally, and completely justified? If you do, then you press the button on the story. If you make a mistake, you correct it quickly and fully, and you don't cover it up. So to me, those are some of the key elements. If you do that, and you let people know you're doing that, I think you build trust, and that's what journalism organizations need to do.
You know, we're living in a moment where the trust in media is at or near a historic low, and you talked about what we can do to to fix that, but it seems like it's worth pausing just for a second to ask what our own role is in this. What's the mea culpa side of the argument? What did we do to cause this to happen?
Well, it's difficult to generalize about all journalism organizations because there's a vast range. And so when people say the media, you ask, well, which media are you talking about? But to the extent that any particular set of organizations have responsibility, one of the challenges we face is that to keep a free press, you have to allow some misbehavior, because you can't allow, in my view, and I'm kind of a First Amendment absolutist, I really believe in it, you can't start allowing certain restrictions. So, well, you can do it, but you can only do it within a certain range. So you have to allow pretty broad opportunity for news people to do things that you wouldn't like. And lots of news organizations do things that you wouldn't like. They sensationalize, they go for just clicks at the expense of important stories. One of the things I dislike the most is you have some lurid piece of video and a news organization will repeat it over and over and over again within the same story. And so you'll watch some horrible attack on somebody 10 times, then you watch it tomorrow 10 times, and it'll be in the promos. So, doing things just for the sake of getting clicks, just for the sake of being salacious, not checking carefully. There's a piling on that goes on. There's a media frenzy, and I think we're usually in one where everybody decides something's a story, and then they pile on and they don't ask tough questions, and everybody has to have the same view. So there's a lot of things that journalism organizations do that you could fault. The problem with trying to use government to restrict that is then you start setting the stage for restricting things you want to allow. So you want a big, noisy, cacophonous world of a variety of media organizations. But again, that's why I go back to your own behavior. You should police your own behavior to act responsibly, and certainly encourage your colleagues in the profession to think about why are we here, what's the purpose, what privilege we have to be able to talk to large numbers of people, and try to do it really responsibly.
So that's a great area of focus especially students, because when you were talking about the three, it just dawns on me that most of the students here have never lived in an environment where the media is trusted. I mean, you talked about this 3-network thing, which was way before a lot of our time. But it would be interesting to hear from you, like, why do you think this lack of trust exists? Sheryl Huggins Salomon is editor-at-large at The Root. I think one of the issues that has affected trust is this siloing that's happened, where people increasingly find themselves living in a media world that reflects their own beliefs and their own sense of what's true and isn't true, and completely ignoring the rest of the world. Talk about that a little bit and how you think that plays into what we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I think that Steve alluded to it a little bit when he talked about how people get information these days, and very often, where are we getting it from? Well, our friends pass, a link, on social media to us, and they're people that we trust. Another term for siloing is information bubbles. So it's that thing where you're only getting information from people that you like and trust and that have common interests or a common point of view on the world. And taking it a step even further, a lot of times, especially with social media, then you might have a debate or a conversation about a particular article, particular thing that happened. People start to argue, and before you know it, you're unfriending somebody, or you're blocking somebody who doesn't agree with your point of view. And that then tightens the bubble even more. So that's a dangerous place to be, but I want to take a step back, because I think that there is an aspect to having information that appeals to your interest, or information about a group that you might belong to, that I think is important. So I come from having spent a number of years managing publications that focused on African American interest and stories. So the Root, News One, Black Voices. And if you go back and you look historically, there's always been an important role, regardless of a group you belong to, of having information outlets that might at least be a platform for stories that you weren't otherwise going to hear in the mainstream news, right? And places where you could have conversations or that would publish opinions that you might not ordinarily hear. And it was especially important in the older environment in which you had broadcast media, you had your local newspaper, you had national media, but you weren't getting most of your news through social media, which makes it, again, easier to sort of create this almost perfect bubble in which you're only hearing what you want to hear. And so I think it's very important, if you find yourself in a situation, there's something called confirmation bias, where if you believe certain things about the world and you get information that reinforces those things about the world, it can lead you to the false impression that that information must be right because it confirms what you believed in the first place. So I think it's very important that if you find yourself in what I call the amen chorus, if you find yourself only getting information, news that you agree with and everyone around you agrees with, that tells you that you're in a bubble. That also, and if you receive information or you see information, particularly from organizations that, I mean, we call them the mainstream media, but I still believe a lot of what comes out of the mainstream media is credible because I know the training that goes into how people report stories. I think that I would just encourage you to be open and willing to receive that information. And then I think apply the types of rules that Steve has talked about, and that I know some of our other panelists are going to talk about in terms of whether or not that information is credible.
So how, well, we've heard, we're almost a year now after the presidential election, which caused a lot of soul searching on the part of the press. And I think this bubble factor that you talked about had a role to play in why a lot of media organizations were surprised by the results of the election. It used to, there was a time when these bubbles were fairly confined to niche audiences or niche publications, but it seems to have broadened into a much bigger thing where even massive news organizations find themselves in these bubbles. Do you agree with that? And do you see any effort on their part to sort of break out of these?
Well, I think first of all, we have to remember that journalists are people. So we're subject to the same forces that the average person is subject to in terms of staying within our comfort zone. So I think that all of us have had to learn how to break out of that. I think that there's another element to it. Many of you may have noticed how local newspapers are closing right and left. Well, another thing that people tend to trust is information about their communities, about their towns, reported by people that they know. Mm-hmm. So that is disappearing. For the for the national publications, what is disappearing are those important feeder networks of information about what's been happening around the country, what's happening locally, that bubbles up and then gets picked up. And so for people in national media, a lot of times they're more isolated because of this implosion of local media. So I think to the extent that we can support and lift up, and that even you all can, if there's a newspaper left in your town, or if it's a site, it might not even be, a Deadwood publication anymore, but a local news source, support it.
And go work for it. I always said it's hard to make a claim of fake news against somebody who's just reporting what time the library opens and what the sports score was. Brian Stelter is the host of Reliable Sources on CNN. Brian, I wanted to talk to you about this. We've all talked a little bit about this sort of how hard it is to work in an environment where the usual setup we have, which is that we have an agreed upon set of facts,
Yep.
and then we debate upon that agreed upon set of facts, how hard it is when we can't even agree on that set of facts anymore. You had a terrific, I thought, interview yesterday with Kellyanne Conway, this was sort of the theme, I thought. Like, you said black, she said white, you said up, she said down, and it was very hard to have a conversation. And this is the sort of world that we all live in, but you are really in it a lot. Can you talk about that and about sort of whether you see a path out of that?
Yes, and I'm going to be really optimistic because I think we're being really down up here. I got to bring the energy up. The media is beloved by the American people. It's just that not everybody loves the same media. It's that some of you trust CNN and some of you trust Fox, but everybody trusts some media. So I think it's backwards to say that no one trusts, the levels of trust in the press are low. Think I'm crazy?
Yeah.
Everybody trusts the media. A year ago tomorrow, President Trump was elected, or a year ago Wednesday, and we all believed it. It happened at 3 in the morning, right? We'll never forget that feeling, whether you loved him or hated him. We actually all believed it, though. We all believed Wolf Blitzer, and we believed George Stephanopoulos when they said that the impossible had happened. Last week, we believed ABC in New York One when they said avoid the West Side Highway, there's something horrible happening downtown. We all trusted them. I was in the control room at New York One at the time when the death toll went from 1 to 4 to 8. Didn't want to believe it, but I knew they were right because they lived their lives being right. We all trusted them. And I think we all trusted yesterday when the authorities said 26 were dead in Texas, even though we didn't want to believe it. I think we all trusted them. Now, we do have differences in certain partisan issues, right? Kellyanne Conway pretended not to believe that Trump's approval ratings are at a record low. But she knows the data is true. She just had to avoid it. So instead of answering my questions yesterday, she just changed the subject. And then I would point out, Kellyanne, you're changing the subject. And we would go around in circles, and it was a little bit of a interesting exercise. But she knows the poll data is accurate, and I think most Americans know the poll data is accurate. But all that said, yes, we have a problem, right? We have a problem because there's a certain segment of society that is anti-media and anti-journalism, that has opted out of mainstream journalism. Yes, they still believe when we report on a truck attack or a gun violent shooting spree, but they don't believe some of the investigations into President Trump because they don't want to, and that's always been with us as a society, right? There's always been a bunch of us that believe in UFOs. Sometimes I like to believe in UFOs. There's always been a bunch of us that believe in conspiracy theories. However, now there's a lot more amplification of those beliefs. It's a lot easier to find those extremists who hate the press because they're all up in your Twitter feed and all up in your Facebook feed. And that does create tensions and problems, I think, and it makes us recognize the struggles we have to win those folks over. But I think the vast majority of the public is hungry for news, hungry for what we do. May not always trust every word of it. We have to keep winning their trust every day. But I'm not going to subscribe to the idea that something is so radically broken that it can't be fixed. My show is called Reliable Sources. So I started doing it 4 years ago on CNN. And to me, I come back to those two words as the premise for everything I do. Everybody's a source now. Everything's a source. The president's Twitter feed is a source of information now. So what's reliable? That's the overarching question, right? What is reliable? And at the crux of that, the core of that is media literacy. How do you determine what is reliable and what is noise and what is BS? And that's definitely getting harder, and I think that's That's at the forefront of my mind these days. It's getting harder to determine what's a lie and what's the truth. And that's the challenge, I think, for all of us up here. But I got to be optimistic, folks. I mean, yes, the president's trying to tear down news organizations. Yes, he's trying to kick CNN's butt. Yes, he's trying to punish news outlets he doesn't like. But it's not working, right? He's failing at that, except among a small base of his most loyal fans. I think it's remarkable how readers and viewers or listeners are paying attention to coverage of the Trump presidency, reading, watching, subscribing. Not everybody, but a lot of people are desperate for information about what's going on, and that's what makes me feel optimistic. Maybe I'll be the bull on the panel. That's what makes me feel positive right now. Kyle, tell me why I'm wrong.
You're wrong. No, I'm teasing. I mean, I think that you're right that the sense in newsrooms, the sense of mission and purpose is higher than I can ever remember it being. People remember why they went into this business in the first place.
Thank you, President Trump.
Right. We all had sort of forgotten, and we were sort of looking at our shoes because the world was sort of, our world, the business model of journalism looks so dire. And by the way, I don't think those issues have been solved. They've just been sort of kicked down the road.
Right.
But I think that I work at Columbia, and so I see graduate students, and they are super switched on about journalism, and you're seeing a lot of people who had left the industry coming back in, wanting to engage. I mean, I think you're right. I think, but I do think that we need to spend some time sort of examining the problem, our role in the problem.
Sure.
Let's talk about.
But we have the best jobs on the planet, so that's why I'm trying to be positive. I mean, we get to wake up every day and answer questions that people have. It's an amazing job. It's an amazing responsibility. But I did pull a little bit of a Kellyanne on you.
You did.
I sort of avoided your question because your question's the really hard one about truth, about how to sort out truth. In fact, from fiction.
Let's talk about how to do that. There's the politics part of it, which is these partisans who will argue about facts.
Yeah.
But then there's what we're learning is, and this is where Michelle's group and media literacy is so important. These Russian-funded disinformation campaigns and the role of Facebook and Twitter in rebalancing people's views of the world, that seems to be an especially vexing problem.
And I like to blame Facebook and Google for that so that I get off the hook a little bit. It's not entirely on them, but it is partly on the technology companies. And I think Facebook's come a really long way in the past year admitting to their responsibility in popping your bubble, in getting you out of your filter bubble. I think you and I would probably argue they got a lot further to go, but these companies at least are starting to think about these problems, about the silos they've put us in. I had this issue in a very small way yesterday. A lot of my fans on Twitter were saying, "Don't book Kellyanne Conway. Don't put her on TV. She's a liar. Don't put a liar on TV." And I got hundreds of emails from viewers who were ticked off at me afterwards, after the interview. But I think that might be part of the problem. If I were to refuse to interview her, refuse to interview a White House official, then I'm kind of putting my viewers in their own filter bubble. So we think through those issues, I think, on a daily basis at outlets like CNN, at outlets like Vice and others, about how do we expose folks to different viewpoints without muddying the waters so much so that you can't tell the difference between fact and fiction.
Ryan McCarthy is the editor-in-chief of Vice News. Ryan, I think one of the things that I think about is whether there has been a failure in the way we tell stories, especially if we're thinking about how do we engage new news readers, viewers, people who are disenchanted and have drifted away. Is there another approach in the way that in the kind of stories that we think about, in the way that we tell them? And this is something that Vice has done very well. How do you How do you think about that?
Yeah, I would count myself among the optimistic group too. Not just because our audience is young. The vast majority of our audience, over 80%, is under 27. Almost 90% of them are on mobile phones, at least on the web. Our HBO audiences, we have 2 HBO shows: Vice News Tonight, our nightly show, and Vice on HBO, our long-form weekly documentary. Our HBO audience is significantly older, but the thing that makes me optimistic about the way media stands vis-a-vis trust right now is that our audience, at least, is responding to cite something that Steve said, show our work a little bit. And that's something that Vice has been really good at. We're not great at the traditional journalistic remove, but we are great at saying, hey, we're a part of this story. We're on the ground in Mosul. We're scared. We're watching a neo-Nazi white nationalist march in Charlottesville. We're scared. We want to take you directly into the action. And the problem with that is that is happening now on a million different platforms. So our HBO audience is older, but our YouTube audience is very different than our HBO audience, which is very different than our Facebook audience, which is very different than our native Facebook audience, which is a huge thing now. And our Twitter audience is definitely the angriest. But we have to fight this battle to show our work a little bit and to take people a little bit behind the story and to say, hey, look, we're humans making these things. We have to do that on 7 or 8 different platforms at any given time in order so all of you start watching and reading and consuming Vice News. So we've had a lot of success doing that. Where we haven't had success is when we do the same story as everyone else. And I think that really speaks to this battle for attention that researchers have called it. You guys should know, coming into the world as citizens, as hopefully future journalists, as students, as just human beings, you should know that the internet, TV is battling for your attention in a way that has never before. So I, as a digital editor, have to spend most of my day figuring out how to get you to read or watch my stuff. But it's not just me. It's people in politics. It's people in Russia. It's people who you agree with, and it's people who you don't agree with. So I think that the real grounding for media literacy for me is knowing that people are selling you something. Journalists are selling you their story, which they've hopefully reported accurately and honestly. But the internet is literally fighting for the dimes and pennies that come from your attention. So I think we've had success when we can be honest about that and say, look, you've heard about this story, but we're here on the ground in Mosul, or we're in the Philippines, or we're in Charlottesville, and here's what's happening. It's a little bit more honest and for us to act that way, because our newsroom is largely under 30. If we wanted to practice the traditional journalistic remove that most media organizations do, we probably wouldn't be as good at it. But I do think there is something to be said that in order to reestablish trust, we have to speak in the language of our audience and speak on the platforms that our audience are flocking to.
By the way, if you haven't seen it yet, Ryan mentioned this documentary about Charlottesville that Vice News did, which is terrific and really worth your time. What about not just the way that we tell stories, but even the kinds of stories we tell? The first part of the panel, especially Steve and Brian are very, traditional news organizations in the sorts of stories that they tackle. Do you think that we need to rethink sort of a whole genre of stories that we should be telling that are? Do you think about it that way?
We do. So even times when we think we have a story that's written in a straight text format that is competitive with some of the biggest media organizations in the world, it doesn't have the impact for us or our audience that it would somewhere else. So we have to fight a different kind of battle. I think for us, Vice News started essentially as a YouTube brand. Long-form documentaries put on YouTube. And now where we've come out is we know that news and information generally is becoming visual. If you go on Facebook, half your feed or more is visual. Snapchat is visual. Instagram is visual. Even Twitter is becoming a video company now. So I think we have to build around the kind of formats that have worked for us. And I think that's sort of where the web and information is heading, is a visual layer on top of a story. And I think Vice has always been good at sort of just turning the camera directly on its subject and letting it roll. After the election, we were as surprised as anyone. So we went out throughout the country and just asked people 6 questions about what happened. And so there were no journalists in that. There were no anchors. There were no correspondents. All that we showed were people talking about what happened. And so for us, like, those are the formats that I think break through this really competitive battle for attention right now. Those may not work for other media organizations. I don't pretend to say that we have any sort of secret sauce, but we're sort of coming at it from a perspective of we know we need to break through in a different sort of way. And our audience wants sort of direct, immediate, and almost like self-consciously honest communication.
You said something interesting, which was, what was the number of your newsroom that was under 30?
Majority, yeah.
That is one of the things that we've seen, the makeup of newsrooms and how that affects the kinds of stories that get told in terms of the age of the journalist, in terms of the race of the journalist, in terms of the economic and geographical diversity of the journalist. And frankly, if you look at the numbers over time, over the last couple of decades on diversity in newsrooms, it's pretty flat. And there's been a lot of talk about it, but there hasn't been a lot of movement there. I'll throw this out to anybody in terms of, does anybody see any Brian, you're the optimist. I mean, do you see any areas of optimism here, or anybody who's sort of approaching this in a way that seems to be moving the needle?
Sure, I do. I'm trying to think of specific outlets, though. I think if reflecting on last year's election versus now, you've seen CNN and many other outlets hire different kinds of commentators and analysts, for example. You know, just mentioning CNN because I work there, there are a lot of voices on the air that weren't there a year ago. Whether that's Selena Zito, who was writing columns about Trump voters in Pennsylvania well before election day, or whether it's conservative commentators who are opposed to Trump for principled reasons. You know, there's a variety of those kinds of voices. You know, on television news, a lot of it is talking about the news, obviously, because the phone has changed everything so profoundly, because the phone is your primary source for news. And obviously when I say your phone, I mean apps that have news sites and Facebook and Twitter feeds, because that's your primary source of news. We do something a little bit different on television. We're talking about the news you're seeing on your phone. And I think having those voices that represent various viewpoints, I think you've seen a sort of, and MSNBC and Fox as well, a hiring of different kinds of folks to represent the Trump presidency.
I would temper that. I mean, I'm optimistic in some ways, but I would temper that a little bit with, if you just come back to the fact that diversity in newsrooms really hasn't budged that much. I think that what we're dealing with now is, if you look at the larger media landscape, the number of jobs in media it's shrinking. Mm-hmm. I think in the last 15 years, between newspapers and I think that we've lost more than 100,000 jobs. If you're looking at local newspapers, that's my understanding of it. Mm-hmm. And then you look at television, you look at magazines, even online publications. So I think in that environment, in an environment of scarcity, I think people become more conservative in their hiring decisions and who they decide to promote. I think when I came into the industry a number of years ago, I'm not going to say how many, but let's look back to, say, the 90s. I am going to own and say this, that I think in the 90s it was actually a time in which people were taking newsroom diversity more seriously than I think now. And I hate to say it, but I think that, and I don't think that necessarily it affects, first of all, who you might see on the screen or who comes into the entry level. But when you start talking about moving up the ranks and making decisions, I definitely believe that right now we're in an environment of scarcity, and that's affecting those numbers and why they stay the same.
And with local newsroom cutbacks, especially at the newspaper level, people in small towns might be getting news from a Facebook community page, from an amateur journalist, or someone who really loves journalism but isn't trained professionally. And that opens up new media literacy questions about how you can have confidence or not in someone's reporting when they're sharing it on a personal Facebook page or in a town's Facebook page. I mean, my local paper in Maryland was shut down a number of years ago, and the replacement for the local paper, there isn't a replacement, but the closest thing to it is a Facebook page for the town where that laid off journalist still posts information of relevance to her community members.
Yeah.
That's a media literacy challenge that's different, because if it's not in print and you can't judge it based on print characteristics of quality, you have to judge it based on digital characteristics of quality, whether you know the reporter, whether they have a track record of accuracy, whether they've put up their credentials on their page, things like that. It's an entirely different media literacy question than it was in the 90s or the 2000s.
I mean, I think we should, I just want to come back to Brian's wildly over-optimistic comments earlier, because I think they needed some challenging. Look, I go part of the way with you to say
You're
that
profitable, right?
Record
readership.
We're not unreliable sources, so just let me speak. Thank you. Not that you don't unreliable sources. You're a very courteous host.
I'm in your house.
But okay. So I agree when there's an event that is commonly understood to have occurred, that people tend to believe it occurred. But what I think is going on, and it's incredibly damaging, and it's really why we're here, is that there's a tremendous lack of understanding or belief that journalists are actually out there trying to get to the bottom of things and tell the truth honestly and fairly. There's a huge belief that journalists are on one side or the other, and that they're simply in it from the left or from the right. There's a huge belief that a lot of journalists make up their sources, which is hugely encouraged by the president, who says that journalists make up their sources. Journalists are being attacked on the streets. Our journalists at Reuters are being attacked at rallies. They're being chased and being basically told that they're the enemy. When you're told that you're the enemy of the people, that has an impact, and a lot of people believe it. And so I think that the fact that people who are largely progressive are signing up to subscribe to progressive publications, and people who are conservative are flocking to conservative publications, and that people have a high level of interest in what's going on. That's certainly true, and that's to the benefit of a lot of news organizations. But we can see in how people react to our journalists, how people react to us, how they react on Twitter, how they assume that we're doing nefarious things all the time when we're actually just kind of trying to do the right thing. That's a phenomenon. The level of hatred is a phenomenon that I think has a lot to do with the fact that people don't really understand what we do. They don't understand how we do it. They don't understand the care we take, how carefully we think about anonymous sources if we're going to use them, how much the senior leadership will look at those issues and decide whether it's appropriate. So I think the lack of understanding that a lot of people in the news business consider it a profession and are doing it professionally, I think that understanding isn't there, and you can see that in all the attacks that take place, and I think that undermines credibility and requires media literacy and makes it so important that we live in a world where educators and students are going to take on these issues. I think it is a real danger. That said, there's a big appetite for news. That said, a lot of people trust a lot of stuff they see, but they distrust a lot of things they should trust, which is one of the reasons we're having this conversation.
Amen.
All right. Before we're gonna open up to your questions shortly, so start thinking of them, and I really hope to hear primarily from the students in the room. Before we do that, how would you think? I'm curious from all of you, like, what if you're a journalism educator, a teacher, and you're trying to prepare students to go out into this world that we've just described in a possibly illuminating, possibly confusing way. Other than what Steve said, which is get stuff right, I mean, the fundamentals. Is there anything, what would you highlight as being the new thing or the wrinkle that people need to be prepared for, especially going into this current climate? That right now this is different, so you should really think about making sure your students understand this. Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, I'm nearly 40, which makes me ancient for Vice News. But what I would say is, what's different now from when I started out 17 years ago, mentors are scarce. So wherever you go, you need to find somebody who has experience to get you into this profession, to teach you when you're screwing up, to tell you your ideas are stupid. That really has been hollowed out in digital newsrooms. And to the diversity question, what I've seen in my last few jobs is a lot of diversity on the lower end of the hiring scale and not as much on the higher end. The other thing I would say is, one of the terrible buzzy words that people use on the web these days is platform agnostic. What that means basically is you can assume that you're going to have a job producing just a text story in today's environment. That is wildly different from even 5 or 6 years ago. At every news organization, they're trying to figure out how they fight these battles on every different platform. And the other thing I would say is, like, your job often as a journalist, especially now in this climate, and I tell this to the people who work for me, is to get yelled at. My journalist sources yell at me all the time. If that's not happening, you're probably doing something wrong. Those are the three things that come to mind.
I would add fact-checking and different ways of fact-checking to that. I've been thinking a lot about how grateful I am to President Trump for his inaccurate tweets. I'm grateful to him for his inaccurate tweets because it gives me a chance to talk about really nerdy, obscure subjects otherwise I would never get to cover. When he tweets and says maybe we should revoke FCC licenses, which is obviously impossible at the current structure they are in, it gave me a chance to write about FCC licenses. It was like, I get to geek out now and talk on television about how licensing works. He actually opens the door to really nerdy, interesting, detailed conversations about how things work when you fact check him, when he is wrong about things. But I'm sort of making light of it. I'm sort of serious about that when the president tweets something, or any politician tweets something that's false, the instinct is write a story about the tweet, when the better instinct is write a fact check to explain what is accurate and what is inaccurate about that tweet. And I was proud of our newsroom on the day that the FCC tweets came out, that we stopped and wrote a story that fact-checked in the lead, as opposed to a story that regurgitated the false tweet, right? So 1,000 little actions like that, 1,000 fact checks of the 1,000 inaccuracies. That's a challenge for newsrooms because we're not necessarily structured or built that way. Our thought process is usually to share what the politician says as opposed to immediately verify or debunk what the politician says. But in this environment where there is an enormous amount of false information being spread by the government, that's what we've got to do. And I've had to rewire my brain a little bit as a writer for stories on CNN.com to rethink the way I write a lead, to rethink the way I write the next paragraph, to rethink who I call for comment, because of all of the propensity for falsehoods.
Sure.
I would say, so I think that there's a greater pressure for young journalists starting out to think about things, about whether or not, to refer back to something that Ryan said, whether or not they're liked, to think about things like popularity, and which I would encourage you not to. Again, it's about telling the truth, and you are probably, and it's true that definitely if people are complaining, sometimes they're complaining because you told the truth. But that being said, I think we have to be honest, and that is sometimes hiring decisions are made, particularly in digital news, in part, but what are your social media accounts? How many followers do you have? Those are factors that are being weighed. So I would just say be very careful. Let's acknowledge that the pressure there, and then you've got, you know, folks like, again, like the president, you know, railing against the media. So that pressure to be liked is there. Please resist it. Yeah.
So I mean, the biggest piece of advice I give is focus on original reporting, because it's really hard. It's fundamental to all journalism, and you can tell stories lots of different ways, but getting information that people don't want you to have is, to me, fundamental to what we do. And not just reporting what people say. You know, fact-checking is very important, but I think going out there and figuring out how to gather information and piece together a story that other people would just as soon you not piece together is so fundamental that if you're good at that, you'll be very successful as a journalist.
And that's how to be noticed by hirers, right? By other newsrooms. For young people in the room, being indispensable at something, finding something that hasn't been reported before, is the way to get noticed. Much more so than being the 50th reporter on a story or the 40th reporter at a press conference. Being the first somewhere else is what makes you special.
Yeah, David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, has a great line about this, where he calls journalism, it's not an intellectual pursuit. What that means, basically, he uses a story about Cy Hirsch during Watergate. The New York Times was getting their ass kicked by the Washington Post. Cy Hirsch called the same source, I think it was 5 or 6 times an hour for 8 straight hours, got the story, caught up. What he means by it's not an intellectual pursuit is, like, it doesn't matter necessarily what school you went to. If you work hard and you call people and you get them to talk to you, you can do great things in journalism. There are not a lot of professions like that where hustle and grit is really so, like, chiefly valued.
Questions? There's a mic right here. Sure.
Hi, my name is Azion Scott, and I go to Hillcrest High School. I'm the editor-in-chief, or one of them, of the Hillcrest Highlighter. And really, I just have a question on, with us being teens, and especially like youth, a lot of the time with like opportunities we're denied because of our adolescence. So as for getting your foot into the door in those situations, what would you recommend, especially with us all being so young? Thank you.
I think you're doing it. Which is you're writing, you're working for the school newspaper. That's what you have to do to get. I mean, it's just a matter of writing and doing the work. But go ahead. Anybody else?
I mean, there are plenty of. I would say definitely internships, particularly when you get to the point where you're going to college. Just don't wait till your second or third year before you start looking at them. There are a lot of opportunities, frankly. And the other thing is look at local media. You know, I think sometimes it's easy to overlook the unglamorous local publication that may be your first source of really good clips, the kinds of clips that will get you noticed by larger publications.
Can I say one other thing, which is that all people who have been in the business for a while, like all of us here, are very aware of how hard it is. And I'm always impressed at how willing any of us, anybody in the field, is to talking to you and meeting with you, and especially now. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think if there's somebody that you respect, that you like, whose work you read, if you call them up, I think more often than not they're gonna sit down with you and talk to you and tell you how they see the world. So there's something about this climate we're in. I think we're all very empathetic for the situation that you all are walking into, and most journalists I know are really eager to help. So you should take advantage of that.
And one thing that's easier now than it used to be, and most things are harder, but one thing that's easier is you can publish stuff yourself, so you don't have to necessarily be looking for a local newspaper. You can publish on Medium, you can write a blog. So I think getting producing work and getting it out there is probably really helpful, because I know when I'm interviewing people, you just want to see what they've done. And it matters to some degree where it's been done, but if you see something that looks really exciting and interesting, it sometimes doesn't matter that much whether you publish to yourself on Medium or whether it's in a newspaper.
I've got one more piece of advice, and I hope it's not controversial, but if you want to go into journalism, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to journalism school, or that you have to go to journalism school as an undergrad. I think, because a lot of times when you get out into the world and into media, they're looking at people who have a particular expertise, can report on a particular beat, so it's okay to know something other than journalism. You definitely want to take coursework, you want to learn how to write, you want to make sure that you are, through internships or what have you, getting clips, for your portfolio, but you don't necessarily have to go to journalism school.
And you all, young people, have something that I don't have, and that I think the five of us don't have, is digital fluency, to a degree that you can only have when you've grown up with a phone since age 10, or I assume earlier. I think we have a hard time in newsrooms wrestling with how profoundly different our world is because of these devices. It's been 10 years since the iPhone came out. It has changed everything to a degree that newsroom leaders have a hard time reckoning with. But it's easier for young people to reckon with, because they've only known this way. They've only known this experience of devices being always available. So take advantage of that, and recognize that you all have skills that newsrooms may not have because of your fluency with digital.
One thing I've noticed among our audience and the younger employees who start working for us, and it's backed up by the data. All the data shows that your generation is reading and watching more things, news and content and everything, than our generation had. The thing that I've noticed that really works well with young people trying to get jobs in journalism is being a conscious and critical consumer of that stuff. People who know what works on different formats, who
Right.
could tell you, look, I saw this there, but that's dumb, this thing's real, and this is really well done. Can we mix and match these formats for your company? That, just being a good reader and consumer of news, is probably one of the biggest steps in actually getting a job, because that stuff comes up right away in a job interview.
I love what you said about attention. Just about attention. The media literacy really is all about attention now.
Yep.
Everyone's trying to sell you something. How do you know whether to buy it? I loved what you said about that earlier.
All right, let's get to another question.
Hello. Hi, my name is Felix Santos. I'm a senior at the Business and Sports School, and my question is, what inspired you or led you to journalism? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Go ahead.
I mean, I'll start. I actually started off my career in marketing. While I was doing that, I started doing newsletters, essentially, for clients. This was before I went to journalism school. Just that idea of being able, I had done, my high school newspaper, my college newspaper, but I didn't really have that sense. But once I had that sense, I started off in business journalism, right? And once I had that sense of, wow, I can gather information, I can publish this, I can inform people, I think it just hit the bug for me. I became a magazine publisher a few years later, and then I went into digital. And really fell in love with digital journalism and never looked back, because now the connection with the audience is so direct and instantaneous. So that's what inspired me.
I liked knowing things before other people knew them. I thought that was super cool. I was a journalist from the time I was at my grade school newspaper, and then my high school newspaper, then my college newspaper. And I also just like, there's something about, and this is something that I think Ryan touched on about, I liked being rude in the sense of like asking people questions that didn't seem appropriate.
That's how I found my wife.
Yes.
really liked that I was asking her so many questions on the first date.
Right.
But it just comes naturally when you're a journalist.
So I found that you could actually make that a thing and make that a career. So,
Oh, yeah.
anybody else?
I wanted to be a TV weatherman. I admired TV weathermen because, well, first of all, when I would call in with my snow total in my town, they would actually put it on the news. And by the way, that basic interactivity, which is even easier now, helps people feel a part of the media and helps them feel involved, especially when you're 7 years old. But on a serious note,
Wait,
TV...
we have to pause right there.
Oh,
you have
boy.
to tell people the name of your child.
Oh, my child's name is Sunny. We're thinking about all weather names for all the kids in our future. I don't think I've said that publicly, so keep that between us, all right, everybody? I have some other weather-related names in our ideas. But if I can be serious for 1 second, TV meteorologists save lives. They save lives. When there's a tornado warning or a blizzard, they save lives. It's just another example of yeah, we got problems in the press, but your local weather person, that's a really important person in your community, especially at a time of severe weather. And we've got to make sure people continue to trust those basics, right, of what they're seeing on television in between all the commercials that you've got to filter out.
All right, I want to get to some more questions.
Yeah.
Back there.
I'm from China, so news is different from here and China. So my question is like, for me, it has been confusing to me. There is no authority in the academy, so everybody has a freedom of speech. But what confused me is that since there's no authority in the academy, so whom to trust? So my question is, so what is truth? Whom to trust and whom do we believe? You know, it's confused me. Thank you so much.
It's the $1 trillion question.
Yeah, it definitely is, and it was easier a number of years back because journalism, news outlets were gatekeepers to a certain extent because everybody couldn't be a publisher. Everybody couldn't, in theory, report the news. Now, anybody can because of the internet. And so we're really grappling with that. We're going from having had a loose confederation of authorities to, it really comes back down to, and this is where media literacy is important, and it needs to be taught from a very early age. Really, a lot of instead of having an external gatekeeper, the gatekeeper is each individual citizen now, and they need to be educated in how to figure these things out.
I was going to be snarky and say that if the President of the United States attacks a news organization, go ahead and trust that news organization. But that would be too snarky. I wouldn't say that.
I just want to go back to the link between good information and making good decisions, because I actually think that's our big usefulness. That's why people pay money for news from Reuters and from news from other organizations, because you need, I just think it's well known, or people understand it viscerally in their own lives, that if you have good information, you can make better decisions. So I think in a sense, we're all competing with each other to provide information that's trustworthy enough so that people can take it and say, yeah, I can make a decision about a financial decision, a personal decision, a political decision, because I know that those facts are being delivered in a way that's dispassionate and is just helping me make my decision. So the notion that our job is to report stuff so that you can decide what to do with it is the way we look at it at Reuters. And I think ultimately, as people recognize that if they have bad information, they'll make bad decisions, that they'll gravitate towards places. But we have to help people understand that we are helping them make good decisions. And that goes to the question Ryan and others have mentioned, transparency. The news industry always used to think that people didn't want to see how we did it, and we didn't want to tell them. Well, now we understand we have to tell them. We have to help people decide whether we are trustworthy, and by showing our operation more. And I think many of us are now doing that.
One more student question before we have to go.
Hi, I'm Andrew Keblish from World Journalism Preparatory School, and I was wondering if there should be some metric for determining the credibility of a journalist, like in the vein of Rotten Tomatoes, or just some stamp of approval something like that.
Well, I know Brian is eager to get on Rotten Tomatoes. I would discourage that. I think a useful way of looking at journalism is to use the tired phrase of the best obtainable version of the truth. So journalists are wrong every day in every organization. What I would say is, if you're to answer the last question too, if you're trying to figure out of all of the news sources on the web and on TV of what you trust, don't just look at what you read in any given moment. Look deeply at what habits you formed. And my guess would be, if you're going back to a place like the New York Times or Reuters or CNN or The Root more than once or twice a month, then you've already suggested to yourself that you trust that source. So I think it would be great as an industry to look at habits, and that's also something that Steve hit at. Are we getting into the basic decisions of your life and helping you choose what's true and what's not true, what decisions not to make? And is that happening more than just fly-by traffic that's coming on social via Facebook? Are you developing deep sort of habits with a journalist? If you are, my argument to you would be that you trust that journalist.
Unfortunately, we could keep going on, but we're cutting into the next group. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.